Well, welcome everybody. We're thrilled that you were able to make it and stay for the entire thing today. I hope your lunches are settling. I know we moved kind of quickly through that, but I expect that this conversation is going to be quite provocative and hopefully, interesting to everybody. It's a little bit different from what we've heard in the morning sessions, and I think the folks at this table have a little bit different of a perspective. I have to say, sitting through the morning, a lot of the conversations around markets and capital, it's not the way that I frame things. So I think this afternoon's conversation will be a little bit of a shift from that. So I'm Nellie Garton, and I am currently the vice chair of the Marie C. and Joseph C. Wilson Foundation in upstate New York. We do work around family homelessness. And we do a lot of work around policy and advocacy, community organizing to kind of move those issues forward in the upstate New York area. I have today with me some of what I consider the best thinkers in social justice funding, and I'm just incredibly pleased to even be sitting at this table with these three folks. These are people who have been involved in this work for a while and are extremely passionate and knowledgeable, and I hope that we'll get into an interesting conversation with all of you. I wanted to frame the conversation just very quickly. I'm not going to take much time at all, but around while we're doing this session on social justice philanthropy, and to shed some light on what I consider an area that is often kind of overlooked as we talk about all these new models, and it's very exciting. There is still a very important place for the work that everybody at this table is doing. And I wanted to make that clear to everybody. The Foundation Center in 2010, oh, are we not? Oh, okay. Distracting from, oh. That's okay with me. So the Foundation Center in 2010 looked at how much of the of philanthropy was going to social justice work, and up until about 2008, it was only 11% of all philanthropic dollars going to social justice causes. It did move up to about 14.7 at that point, and that was with the addition of the Gates Foundation and some of their investments in social justice, and they had, I believe it was about 22 of the 25 largest grants in social justice funding that year. So the other piece that, we're talking so much about markets and value and that sort of thing, and it has been found that this type of investing or funding, however you frame it, is extremely effective and cost effective. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy has been doing work trying to quantify this, and put out a report that found that for every dollar that goes into organizing, community organizing, advocacy, and civic engagement, there is a $115 return on that investment. And I'm not an investment person, but for my money, $1 to $115, I will take that. So I just wanted to put those two quick statistics out there. I'm going to turn it over to the panel to talk a little bit about themselves, the organizations that they work with, some of the strategies that they use, just to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll move into a couple of questions, and then open it up for a discussion to all of you. So, so why don't we start with you, David, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Again, Henry Allen. I'm the executive director of the Discount Foundation. But just for 2 more months, I'm retiring June 1st. But I've been in philanthropy for about 21 years, so I want to try to bring some of that perspective over the last 21 years of working in, I think, what we broadly define as social justice philanthropy. And I think you'll get a clear and very strong definition of what that is as we talk about our foundations and the work that we do and who we make grants to. Because it really is all in definition. I think almost any funder could say social justice philanthropy, we do that, and that may not be off the mark, but I think to sharpen that, we'll talk about our actual work and who we invest in and why we call that social and our instance at the Discount Foundation, it's economic justice, and we're very clear about that. So that in the 5 minutes that I have, I want to say a little bit about the Discount Foundation and kind of our focus and funding priorities. And then we'll have an opportunity later on to kind of dig in a little deeper about the actual work that we do. So Discount has been around since 1977, and there are at least 5 or 6 different explanations of the name, Discount, so I'm not even going to try to tell you what that is. But it has always been a foundation that's been about low-wage workers. And it's always been a foundation that has really believed that community organizing, the process of building power amongst low-wage workers to change the conditions of their work, to lift themselves and their families out of poverty wages and low-wage work, that community organizing is really central to people coming together and building collective power to change public policies that affect them as low-wage workers. A few years ago, after many, many years of doing this kind of work, funding community organizing, affecting low-wage workers, the foundation decided to try to get even sharper in its focus. And this is not unlike foundations across the country. It's about impact, it's about focus, it's how you make a difference with very limited resources. So for us as a really a small national foundation, you know, our grant making the last couple of years is about $1 million a year, and so you compare that to a Gates or a Ford or others, we're minuscule. So what do you do with $1 million, especially when you're a national foundation? So we decided to really focus on what we call organizing for worker justice. And what that means to us is a belief that worker organizing represents a crucial avenue for low-wage workers to achieve greater economic justice, to change the conditions of their work, to address issues like wage theft, which is unfortunately a $30 billion a year industry by employers who steal literally $30 billion a year from the working poor. Health and safety. In Texas, it has the highest death rate of construction workers of any state in the country. Literally hundreds of workers each year are killed or injured or maimed on the job, and those statistics can be found throughout the country. So how to change those conditions? What is it that allows workers themselves to address those issues? And we have, in addition to that larger focus of organizing for worker justice, we have 2 very specific funding priorities. One is what we call the right of workers to form unions. We're one of the very, very few foundations in the entire country that explicitly states that we believe in the right of workers to organize unions, and we will fund community organizing groups that are working with unions to address the right to organize, and I'll talk more about that later, and organize unions. And the second focus is what we call independent worker organizing. The recognition that there are workers that, particularly in what's called the marginalized workforce, undocumented immigrants, low-wage workers, others, who the goal of organizing into a union is very long range. So what are the kind of first lines of self-defense for workers? Day laborer centers, immigrant worker centers, interfaith worker centers. There's a whole slew of independent worker organizing that's taking place from the ground up amongst workers who are just trying to find some way to organize to protect themselves and advance the interests of themselves and their families. So that gives you hopefully a snapshot of the Discount Foundation, who we are, our focus, and our funding priorities.
That was very efficient and exactly 5 minutes. Well done.
Well, I don't know if I can live up to that, but I'll try. The Lenny Zakim Fund was started by Lenny Zakim, and many of you may know who Lenny was, and if you don't, you know about the bridge. And Lenny was a civil rights leader in the city of Boston, and he died very young. And what he left as a legacy, in addition to improving your ability to get to Chelsea, was or Charlestown, was a desire to fund small grassroots organizations that are doing a wide variety of social justice work. So that includes community organizing and advocacy, but also a lot of other work. the main thing that our mission, is very broad. It says things like combat poverty, stop violence, but what really sets the work apart is a focus on some very specific strategic areas in the last few years, and most importantly, a very strong focus on organizations that are small. And you may think you know what small is, but let me tell you, I know what small is. And Melissa, the other half of the Lenny Zakim Fund, is here today, and she just ran some statistics, and I think the median budget we support is $169, something like that. A lot of programs with budgets well under $100,000. So we don't have a budget cutoff. That is part of what we do is we really try to look at what we mean by grassroots without setting barriers to apply for funding. One of the things we consider to be most important is it the real deal? And that's something we hear our board say all the time, is it the real deal? And what we mean by that is the program authentically of the community? And so there are all kinds of organizations making a better world and all kinds of philanthropy. But our goal is to really locate programs that are often started by somebody who sees a need in their own community and then sees that they in fact have they have an answer. It may not be the answer, it may not be an answer worthy of a social impact bond, but it's something that's going to make a really, really big difference in what they're doing. We go out and we look for programs, which I think is a little bit different, because we really are trying to find those small agencies that are making a difference. We fund throughout Eastern Massachusetts. And I think that our programs fall into 2 or 3 different categories. Sometimes they are tiny, tiny, tiny program in Brockton, and all it will ever be is a social space for 30 to 40 severely disabled adults, and that's great because for them it's all the difference in the world. So, and other programs that are very small. On the other hand, we fund some programs that are emerging, and someday they're going to take over the world. There are a number of larger programs we funded, like Roca and UTEC and Teen Voices over the years. And then the third group is tiny little programs within larger agencies, and that's the smallest piece of what we do, but it is a piece. And lastly, because we do raise all the money that we give away, one of our strategies is to build community, because every donor, whether they give $5 or $50,000, has the opportunity to be part of our grant allocations process. And I wish more people would take advantage of it. It's not a problem for us yet. If it were, that would be great. And that we also do a ton of technical assistance and training and provide pro bono legal, and that's our story.
That was also very efficient. You guys are great.
Well, let me ruin
Okay.
that for you. I'm just gonna go on and on.
David.
My name's David Moyes. I'm a program officer with the Hyams Foundation, and the area that I work in specifically is the civic engagement, public policy organizing area. We also fund in the area of affordable housing development and public policy related to that, as well as youth development, particularly in the area of youth who've been long disengaged from the system, from public schools, from employment opportunities, basically the folks that we need to have an impact on, that were talked about this morning. I just want to say, in terms of my role in the foundation, it's been fairly new. It's as the Chinese blessing goes, may you live in interesting times. I've been at the foundation since 2005, and it was an easy ride for the first couple of years, but it has been quite interesting since then, because we live in interesting times. But prior to that, I've actually worked 20 years as an executive director in 2 different organizations, and would have been very much consumed by and engaged and enlivened by the discussions from this morning, which focuses on social innovation and social impact and how we can do much better. But I have to tell you, after 20 years of doing that, in a fairly key role as the ED, that I have become increasingly, and I remain increasingly, concerned that we are losing sight of what the critical issues are and the role that philanthropy can play in that. So in particularly, I think what I would say about the grassroots piece is that it is not about grassroots from the highest perspective, grassroots in terms of size. What we're talking about is grassroots in terms of working with the community, the people who comprise the community. Much as what Dan Colney, I think his name was, from the Haley House talked about. It's not enough for us to think we can do for and do to improve, but to really listen in a deep way to the people in the community that we work with. Because in fact, they are not some folks that we do services to. They are our partners in building a community. And I would argue our partners in building a better society. So we're gonna have a deep discussion, I think, coming up, but I wanna just frame that discussion this way for all of you who are looking at the role of philanthropy. So here's a quote: "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which have created the need for philanthropy in the first place." That is what we're struggling with, and I felt like in many ways the discussion this morning missed the point except for what Joe Kreisberg raised in the second panel. And that's what I hope we will have a deeper discussion about in this particular room. So thanks.
Great, thank you. I also picked up on those two panelists and thought that Joe Kreisberg did a very nice job kind of setting this discussion up for us. So I think, you guys gave a little bit of your definitions, but just so that everybody is on the same page, if maybe you could each go through and talk about your definition of social justice and community-based philanthropy, and provide a concrete example of an organization that you support that is doing that work and why you support them. Why don't we start over here with you, Jude?
Sure. Our definition of social justice is at the macro level, community organizing and advocacy, and we support a fair number of organizations. We probably have some overlap.
A lot of overlap.
Thank
you.
I know, right? And well, all right.
We're gonna suck up to each other because we're gonna partner.
One that comes to mind right away is Brockton Interfaith Coalition, and it's an aggregation of congregations in Brockton, and they have a community organizing faith-based model like a lot of people do, based I think a lot on GBIO and other work. And they have gotten the city of Brockton to go from a large national bank to a local bank to make real changes in community policing and in the schools. So that would be one example. And another example more on the service end is I'm going to get this wrong, I think the East African Community Organizing Group, something like that, in Worcester. And it's this tiny little program, tiny, like budget of what, $40,000 a year. People from East Africa who have organized themselves to provide all kinds of services. They don't really do organizing, but ESOL, helping each other go get driver's licenses, all kinds of things. So those are two ends of the spectrum of what we call social justice. The macro, and then, like the old standard says, until the real thing comes along, we still need a lot of service at the grassroots.
David, particular examples?
Sure. So I should step back a little bit. So the Hyams Foundation used to fund a lot of services, and increasingly it has shifted. Its new mission is to really to support and develop the voice and power of low-income communities of color, low-income communities, particularly communities of color. And so the civic engagement area, we fund groups specifically that are interested in surfacing and identifying issues that are not particular to individual or family, but really issues that really cut across the community, and I would say even across society. So in terms of our funding, we are looking for places to really partner with groups that really get at the root causes of, or attempt to get at the root causes of those problems. And that's really hard to do, and as was discussed this morning, I mean, the idea of social impact, how do you measure it? Is it outputs or is it outcomes? I would argue we're looking for outcomes, and hopefully the outcomes is really around changing larger systemic problems that really impact not just, you know, small group of individuals, but really large groups of individuals. So examples, I can give you quick two examples. One would be we have been funding for a long time actually the development of immigrant workers, their ability to organize, to develop their skills, their awareness, and their ability to work together to fight systemic abuses and exploitation that Henry actually talked about earlier. That there is this incredible underground economy where workers are being exploited. And that's part of this system, and we benefit from it without even knowing it. But I think what we did was we funded groups to develop their internal capacity to work with each other, their skills and awareness, to the point where in 2008 they were able to actually pass in this state what's called a triple damages law, and that is to say that employers that were caught willfully exploiting workers, stealing their wages, underpaying them, much as the case recently you might have heard about the Upper Crust Pizzeria and so forth. That means those folks would have to pay triple the amount of wages that they have stolen. And the idea of that is to bring some sort of restorative justice for the workers that are being exploited, but also to send a message across the society, this is not frickin' acceptable that they can exploit people in our community. So that's an example of really going at the system rather than saying, oh, let's give you better skills so you can get better jobs. But that misses the whole point. There is a system which is being perpetuated against low-wage workers.
Yeah, great.
The other one I was going to talk about is Corey, but I think we're going to skip it, save for later.
Okay.
Corey reform is another issue, which actually gets at the Haley House example. So.
Absolutely. We'll have time to.
So just another word on this whole issue of wage theft that David has talked about, I've mentioned. I want to just refer to a publication called The Movement to End Wage Theft, which is a research report that the Discount Foundation commissioned. It's available on our website at www.discountfoundation.org. You can download it for free, get it. But it talks about, I think, what is critical development, which is not just individual organizations struggling at the grassroots with how to confront unscrupulous employers, but actually the emergence of a movement across the country to address this by coalitions of organizations at the local, regional, and national level. And so this report talks about the scale, but not only the scale of what's happening with wage theft, and there's something that does it far beyond this report I also want to mention, which is Kim Bobo, who is the executive director of a national organization called Interfaith Worker Justice, just published the second edition of her book called Wage Theft in America. And really much of this work over the past few years, the organizing around it, the building of an economic justice movement flows from her work and the work of Interfaith Worker Justice. So I wanted to lift that up. So let me just turn from wage theft for a moment and just mention a couple of other examples which I think give definition to what we mean by social justice and economic justice philanthropy. So the foundation funds in two regions of the country warehouse worker organizing. So in California, there is a region called the Inland Empire, about 60 miles east of LA. It's the single largest concentration of warehouses in the entire world. It is where all of the goods that are shipped into the ports of LA and Long Beach are unloaded in cargo containers and then either shipped by truck or rail to these warehouses, which they're then offloaded into the various companies that will distribute these goods. Obviously, the single largest importer of goods in the world is Walmart, by and large. Walmart is the corporation that sets all of the working conditions, wages, health and safety, everything for the entire warehouse industry and the retail industry. There are approximately 100,000 warehouse workers in the Inland Empire working for these various companies that have these warehouses. None of the workers work for Walmart or Target or Sears or Costco. They work for temp agencies, subcontractors. So all of these 100,000 workers, 60% of whom are undocumented immigrants, they are classified as temporary workers. They are therefore excluded from any protections of the National Labor Relations Act. They cannot legally organize a union. They're not protected under a host of laws. So what we fund there in another area of the country called the Midland Empire, which is about 60 miles south of Chicago and Joliet and other areas, there's another complex which is the second largest concentration of warehouses in the world, on which there are about 90,000 warehouse workers. So our grant in the Inland Empire goes to a group called Clergy and Laity Concerned for Economic Justice, which is a statewide network of interfaith organizations that mobilize faith communities, economic justice groups, other allies, and the workers, to help the workers organize to confront these conditions in these warehouses, where workers are terribly exploited in terms of wages and working conditions, health and safety. And similar in the region 60 miles south of Chicago, we're funding another group called Warehouse Workers for Justice. So those are two examples where our grants are going to grassroots organizing groups to work with the workers to bring together coalitions, to build the economic power of these workers to change their working conditions. And they have, what's important about these organizations, I think, is how sophisticated they need to be. If you're going to go up against the largest private employer in the world, which is Walmart, 1.6 million employees, single largest employer in this country and in the world, which sets all of the conditions for work and wages. How do you build sufficient power to get Walmart to raise the wages of its associates in its warehouses and in its stores? That's going to take considerable time, sophistication, and resources. And that means good research, good public policy, good relationships with state legislators and policymakers who are sympathetic. So it's a very complex kind of campaign. It's nothing that the workers themselves are going to kind of go out and change the conditions in these warehouses. It really is organizing themselves first and then looking for allies in many other places that can begin to get a corporation like Walmart to change its employment practices.
Great. I think it's always helpful to have concrete examples of this work. We're talking a lot about inequity this morning and kind of shifting power. And I guess the big question for me, given what we were hearing about this morning about these shifting economic models and market-driven solutions and all that sort of thing, for all of you, is why is this work still really important to do? Why haven't you switched your strategies over to social impact bonds and using all of those different levers? Why is this work still critical? And I guess I will start with you, David.
Wow. So I guess the way to look at it is again back to some of the panel discussions this morning. I mean, are we looking for outputs, or are we looking for outcomes, and outcomes specifically in what arena and in what ways? So I mean, I did hear a presentation from someone about the social impact bonds, and they were talking about how it worked and how it's going to save money. I would argue that within the system that there are actually quite a number of programs that currently, and having worked in an agency that piloted some very effective work, I think there is already effective work going on. That's not the issue. The issue is whether you're impacting in a larger way the conditions or the system that creates that problem in the first place. So let's look at what they're talking about. I mean, in terms of let's say education. I mean, education, we saw today, Barry talked about the growing disparity in this country, despite the fact that we have the best minds working in across the different fields and in the community services arena. Yet we have, at this point, the greatest economic disparity since the early 70s. So something is wrong. Something is wrong there. And so I would argue, again, one of the things that Barry pointed out was the need for education, that education is the biggest way to move people out of dire economic circumstances. And I think people recognize that, and so there's a lot of investment in that. And yet what we see increasingly is, as Joe says, a way to privatize the risk, or privatize the rewards, but socialize the risk. So what we see is, in this country, people working, or entities working against that. So you have a diminishing amount of public investment in public education and in student loans and student grants, and the private entities stepping in and really investing and reaping rewards. And frankly, the middle class is finding out, and that was what the Occupy movement was about, when middle class white folks in the community find that they're saddled with $100,000+ loans and they can't pay it back because the economy's tanking. So you can invest in these things, but does it get at the root cause of the problem? So I think the challenge for us at the Hyams is to look at what groups are really doing a deep analysis of the underlying cause of the problems, and to fund that, and also recognizing that no one, as they say, there's no one actor in the field that can claim causal credit for what's going on. We're looking at groups that are willing and able to work across communities, across groups, across their their own egos to really have a larger impact. So that's the way we're looking at it at this point. And frankly, it's not easy. We're still working on it.
Yeah, definitely. Jude, do you have thoughts on why it's critical?
I think that one kind of inequity is the inequity about who makes decisions about what social programs are and how they are addressed. And when you kind of there's room for all kinds of philanthropy, but when you really look at social change, social impact from what I would term, and I am a corporate refugee, 25 years in that world, what I would call a more corporate model, then where is not necessarily the voice, but where is the action of the people who are being, finger quotes, helped? And where are their solutions? And so I think that is one reason why we see the grassroots work as being important. And two other things that were people talked about this morning. They talked about the importance of taking risk. I am going to go out on a limb and say that the large institutions in this country don't always take risks on new solutions, and that leads me to innovation. There are problems that may appear to be intractable, not only in how they're solved, but how they're addressed. And the really interesting answers, to give a couple of examples, inner city weightlifting, I know John's speaking on another panel, those really innovative programs, they don't come top down. They come from somebody who said, here's an issue and this is crazy brilliant and I'm going to try it. And those are all the reasons I think it's important.
Great. It sort of gets to the question someone asked earlier about how do you find those groovy groups, so it'll be interesting to ask that.
Sure, so let me use the example again around kind of what I'm most passionate about in terms of looking at this question of education. So I think we're all familiar with workforce development programs and how critical those are in terms of people getting access to skills training, to the ability to gain sort of new knowledge that allows them to advance in the workplace, in the economy. And who could argue that those aren't incredibly valuable and important to those individuals, to their families, to their communities, to this society, to this economy? One has to ask the question at the same time, what happens to folks who either are not eligible for or not engaged in those workforce development programs? One has to ask the fact that perhaps 2 or 3% of low-wage workers are engaged in workforce development training programs. So what happens to the other 97%? Are they condemned to work in poverty, to work 1 or 2 jobs and to earn poverty wages? How do you get at, as David said, the root cause of what is keeping those people while they're working 1 and 2 jobs, and while they're excluded from workforce development programs because they might be undocumented immigrants, because they might not have the education skills in the first place to get into those programs, whatever the reason. And so what Discount is focused on is how do we engage with those workers directly, with the organizations that authentically represent them through independent worker organizing or union organizing committees, and say, in the here and now, in this workplace, we have a right to earn a decent wage. We have a right to paid sick leave. We have a right to health and safety protections. Whether or not we ever get another day of education in our lives, whether we ever get into a workforce development program, we are workers here and now. We deserve respect. We deserve to earn a decent wage. Whether you're working in a retail outlet, at a corner store, in a supermarket, in a warehouse, or domestic work, or whatever the case might be. So we're interested in the kind of authentic organizing of those individuals who find themselves in those situations, not to the exclusion to their opportunity to get further education, further training, to lift themselves into the middle class in whatever way they can. But the reality is, for millions of low-wage workers, that is not going to happen in the short run. And so what happens in the short run, or the medium run, or maybe even the long run, to ensure that those folks and their families have a right to a decent wage and a decent life? And that's where organizing is absolutely critical, and why if only 14% of philanthropic dollars are going to social justice philanthropy, as we've tried to define it, we have to look towards a time when it's 20, 30, 40, or 50%, because it's not either or. It's not that any of us are opposed to funding services. I don't see those as absolutely critical in terms of building healthy communities, providing support to families. It's that we'd like a little bit of balance. We'd like to say that there is abundant proof and evidence that funding social and economic justice philanthropy, as Nellie pointed out earlier, makes a huge difference. In the 1970s, when community organizing groups got the federal government to pass the Community Reinvestment Act and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, this took years of organizing at the grassroots from people who were living in dilapidated housing. And as a result, literally billions of banks and mortgage companies have been required to invest literally billions of dollars for affordable housing, affordable economic development in low-income neighborhoods. And that's certainly money well invested and has huge payoff for organizing, for funding organizing.
Right. So I'm just going to toss out one more quick question based on the discussion earlier this morning. It came up a lot about having authentic relationships with your grantees, which, given the power dynamic of being the ones holding the purse strings, how do you do that? It's not a question we discussed beforehand, so I'm just sort of tossing that out there. But I think it's a really critical one to hear how you think about having authentic relationships with your grantees and actually hearing what their needs are and doing that critical listening that people were calling for. Any of you like to field that?
Well, I think I'll just a couple of minutes. I mean, David, I think, hit on the key point, which is a deep listening and respect for folks in communities, a sense that people who are living these experiences have the most knowledge about what's affecting them and their families. And not only do they have that experience and knowledge and insight, but they also have to be the people that help shape the solutions to what's affecting them in their communities. And that's what organizing and social justice philanthropy is all about. And I think it really begins with recognizing, as Nellie said, there is a power dynamic. I mean, I'm sitting in my foundation, and along with my trustees, I control $1 million a year and where that goes. And every applicant knows that. And so how you don't ignore it, you don't make believe it's not there, how you say it's there, and now let's try to figure out a way in which I can understand who you are and what your work is about, you can understand who we are, what our work is about, and try to find some common ground that allows us to have an authentic conversation about what work they're doing and where there might be the possibility of our investing in their work. And I think it just takes, a kind of humility that is not easy for people who control a lot of wealth. And I think it does come down to humility in a sense that we don't have the answers.
Yeah.
We have resources, we have the ability to understand, to partner, but the real answers lie in the community.
I don't know if there's, the only thing I would add to that, because I think that was really on target, Henry, is that it's important as funders that we go into the community, that we're not in our office making people come to us. So that, and we don't just go for site visits or events, but that we're in the community with the organizations, and also just kind of in the community, I mean, for other reasons. And so that we have the best understanding we can possibly have of who we're working with, what they're doing, and what they're trying to achieve.
So, a little bit of echoing what both Jude and Henry were saying. I mean, I think we do need to listen deeply. We need to go out there and listen deeply, and to do that, you need to have some humility, deep humility. I mean, I haven't been in the foundation that long. I used to be 5'3" and IQ of 100, but since then I've been 6 feet tall and blonde, blue eyes. I look like
Big
Brad Pitt
muscles.
according to people in the community because I have money. So I think there is a power imbalance, and we need to be aware of that and try to play that down. And part of playing it down is really to recognize that that again, as I said, we're in partnership with the community. If we are truly committed to an outcome, a set of goals that we talked about, and if that's about social change and more just society, then we need to recognize we don't have the money. I think Joe Kreisberg, the bomb thrower this morning, was quite on. He says, we might have money trying to change things, but guess what, folks? There are people out there with bigger money trying to go the opposite way. And the biggest example of that's not even hidden anymore. The biggest example of that's Citizens United, the court decision 2010. That means you look at this election, you know how much money it's going. None of the social justice or socially progressive foundations can match the amount of money going the other way right now. I mean, we talk about trying to support unions. Well, guess what? I think as of this year, there's now 23 states which are called right-to-work states. Right-to-work means people don't have to pay union dues. They don't have to join you. Even if they go into jobs that were created by unions or the benefits were created by unions, they were allowed to not support that. And that is, those things don't happen in a vacuum. There are groups that are funding the work to do that. Because ultimately, in the long run, it will undermine the resources for the unions and the ability of workers to unite. So there is active money right now going the other way. So as a foundation, as a small foundation, I would be pretty, full of myself to think that my money is going to make a difference. It is really the folks in the grassroots, the folks who are hopefully creating a democracy with their activism and their willingness to learn and to vote on the issues. Those are the folks that will make a change in our society, not the people with the money. Because our money doesn't match the money going the other way right now.
Great. Thank you all. I wanted to open up to any questions in the audience. Yeah, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move over here.
Thank you. The question is more around, as a foundation, the words that you like to use are the effectiveness, efficient organization piece. It's always there. But when you look at community organizing, it's the smaller, the let's move it, let's connect type of stuff. So as an organization becomes more effective and efficient, that whole balance, can you talk a little bit about the type of organizations that you're seeing? Are they the smaller, more grassroots, trying to move an agenda on a faster, quicker, immediate basis because the clientele, in this case, are the ones that are, and not that you use the word, but I will use it, abused in our society. So how do you work with that type of effectiveness, efficiency, and an immediate need of your constituents? In fact, I'm going to start with you.
So all of the groups that we fund are trying to build more and more power. They want more resources. They want more capacity to do research, affect public policy, develop new leaders. So our goal, along with the other funders in this country that are funding organizing, want these organizations to be efficient, effective, and bigger. We want them to develop more capacity. Jude mentioned how much technical assistance they provide to these sort of smaller grassroots groups. We do a little bit of that. So I think what has to be, I think the vision of these organizations has to be matched with capacity and resources, and the kind of the capital that's needed to extend their reach and their effectiveness. But as they grow, as they develop, as they gain more power, we definitely, as a funder, we're evaluating this. I think we have to do due diligence. We have to really look at how our money is invested. My trustees demand. The first thing they say is, we know that community organizing, workplace organizing can and should be evaluated. Mm-hmm. We don't pull back on that at all. We don't say, well, organizing is a different thing. You can't evaluate it like social services. Well, you can and you must. Not only because funders are going to demand it, but because it's important for the organizations themselves to figure out, what they're doing right and what they're not doing, as well. And so I think we just have to recognize that as they grow, there's no downside, hopefully, to sort of efficiency and effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. And there's some different metrics.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess this is a time to plug, some work we did, and it sits on our website unnoticed and unread. We actually, as we looked at it, we did try to go out and look at, what was happening across the country, who's funding what, and how do they measure it. And we actually developed on our website, it's on our website in a download session. Our website's horrible, by the way, but go to the download session. There is a logic model and an evaluation tool about public policy organizing and also grassroots leadership engagement and development. And I point to different things because I think in this world, it's an ecosystem, and there's room for different layers of development, and we need to have all of that. So if we want to move on a big public policy issue, you need groups that, as to use the terminology, to scale. They're connected, they're big, right. They do PR, they have access. If you do need to do that. So that's one level. But at the same time, those groups, those folks are coming out of, at least in the beginning, some developmental stages where they're a small group in the community that are noticing that the system is not working for them and that they need to surface their issues. So there's a need for support for emerging communities and emerging groups and issues, because otherwise it will be the tyranny of the mass scale organizations. Part of this is about democracy and surfacing new issues, new information, and responding accordingly. So you have to, I think as funders, we need to be aware there's an ecosystem that has different levels of development. Mm-hmm. The challenge for us is to figure out, with limited resources, which part can we fund? And at Hyams, frankly, we fund the emerging piece and the sort of the middle level, and we're looking at the bigger level. And we know we can't do all of it, so we look to people like Jude and others and Henry and saying, can we, and Nellie knows about it, we're trying to build within ourselves a connection where we can maximize our resources and try to cover as much of the ecosystem as possible. Otherwise, we're not going to have impact.
I think one way as funders we could enhance our own effectiveness is if we had our own ecosystem and sort of said, okay, here's a continuum of funding as organizations grow and mature that was better articulated than what any of us see today.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to add in, David mentioned there's a group of funders here in the Boston area that are doing social justice work that get together to talk about, who's funding whom and which pieces fit into your bailiwick versus mine, and to try and coordinate that, which is also happening at the national level, although not quite as effective. Has it been named?
It's called Emerging Social Justice Funders Network.
Uh-huh.
And then within that, there is actually a progressive organizing funders collaborative too. So it's a small group within a bigger group. But
right.
the idea is there's an ecosystem.
Is there a website for this, or you can find
No, this is all
Yeah.
emerging work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not emerging work. There's nothing new under the sun. Henry
Right.
actually started a lot of this early on. It sort of died down. Some of us have picked up the banner.
As soon as I left, it died down. And it's picked up again with you.
Speaks to leadership. Speaks to leadership.
Can I just,
So we-
I just want to mention that this is, I think as was said, happening on the national level. There's one
Mhm.
group I want to mention, which is the Working Group on Labor and Community Partnerships, which is a network of funders across the country that are focused on worker justice organizing. We cannot do this work alone if we're going to be effective, as Nellie said. So we're trying, this has been going for about 14 years. It's a learning community, it's networking, it's leveraging resources. You know, our $50,000 grant to the warehouse workers is not going to change the Walmart practices. So we leveraged another few $100,000 in grants to really go to this organizing effort, and it's this working group, which is part of the Neighborhood Funders Group, and it is on their website, so you can look at that.
NFG.org.
Yeah.
NFG.org. I
Yeah,
think.
and two other national groups. There's the Social Justice Philanthropy Collaborative, which I've been the chair of for a couple of years now, which is now merging with the Social Justice and Peace Communities of Practice that was funded by Ford to bring together over 300 funders internationally to talk about how to collaborate better. So we had the first question over here, and then I see you over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just following Midalska, and just sort of listening to David's and especially Henry's remarks, I guess I wanted to ask a question about the idea of education really being the answer to everything. Particularly your point about, school loans, for example.
Mhm.
Personally, I think there's something wrong with a system where you want to get educated, and I happen to be both immigrant and first generation college educated. That there's something wrong, essentially, kind of at the very deep level, with a system where you finish school at the negative. You're not even starting from zero. You started in negative. So I just wanted to kind of, in the context of is really education the answer to everything. And sort of to Henry's points, again, having the immigrant background, and your point about workers, being here and now, many of them undocumented, sort of playing the devil's advocate. How about whether immigrant or not, but certainly the documented. There's a lot of people who are, very low wage, and how do we address that
So why don't we
in the
take,
context of education?
so if we can have sort of quick responses to get to a couple others as well. So do you want to start?
I think we still believe, we like to believe that this is a meritocracy, and again, education has been proven. Even now, if you get a BA, there's studies that amply document that this, the separation of what the economic returns are from that investment as opposed to people who don't finish. The issue at this point is that what people aren't aware of is that the education, public support for education, we think it's separate from the public realm. But in fact, it's not. There's public investments in terms of loans and grants that I got as a student that's no longer as accessible. There's investments in public institutions like community college, state college, and so forth. All that is being all that public support has been eroded. And at the same time, people know they still have to get an education. So instead, it's being privatized. And that is what we're being saddled with. People are now noticing that they're saddled with incredible debts from private institutions when they leave college, that they don't have an opportunity to get ahead because they come out in a deficit. But at the same time, the numbers show if you don't get an education, you won't have the same level of economic returns. So what does that leave? That leaves what Barry Bluestone talked about today, which is the lack of mobility at this point. That the rich who have the resources will continue to grow, and their offsprings will continue to grow. I saw anybody seen 60 Minutes yesterday? They showed this 26-year-old Russian billionaire's daughter who's investing $4 million in a new piece of art because they have nothing else to invest in. Just think about that. There's no money to go. The investment in art's shooting up while everything else is shooting down. There are people who have resources that we can't even imagine. And they can go buy a piece of art for $4 million, whereas we can't even get the education we need to make sure that we can earn a decent living. That's the problem, and that's a public problem.
I mean, just very quickly, I appreciate the question because I didn't want to leave any impression that our foundation is just focused on undocumented workers, because whether they're immigrant workers, whether they're documented or undocumented, the level of exploitation is severe. It's just that, as we know, undocumented workers have fewer protections in the workplace, in community. It's much more difficult for them to address the employer or the community. So our grants are across the range. In many workplaces, it's documented and undocumented workers. And leadership development is absolutely key to any good organizing. You have to have leaders, and that's where another kind of facet or focus on education is leadership development, because folks in community and workplaces need to develop the kind of skills to confront power and change the conditions of work. And so we very much believe in education, just education at the community level.
Great. Yes.
So, a couple of things. Today's been very interesting for me. But as to education, I work in education. I work for an inner-city scholarship program. And I think there's a larger problem. I think the larger problem is that education is a necessity, but I feel like the value has been diminished a little bit because, 30, 40 years ago, you went to college and you were essentially granted you access to more. And I think that's been diluted a little bit. And I think it's not only been diluted a little bit from an employer standpoint, but I think it's also been diluted a little bit from the kids who I work with. They go to college for the sake of going to college because that's what they're supposed to do. They're not necessarily going to learn. That education can be powerful when you're going to learn, but when you're going to go to college because you think you're supposed to go to college and you're not really taking in what's offered to you as much as you're just waiting to get out, and then you're kind of back at square one. So I think education it's a double-sided sword, I guess. But what I've taken away from today, and it's been like an amazing day, like on page 4 or 5 of jotting stuff down, is, and I think the lady in front of me in the purple shirt, I think she was kind of alluding to it, is that there has to be some sort of, and I'm not the guy to start it, but there's got to be some sort of form where people can share, grantors can share, the programs that they're supporting and kind of the best programs, because I work for the Red Sox Foundation, and we do both. We give out grants, and then we don't receive any endowment from the team, so we take in grants and we write a lot of grant applications. And it's, for us, the program that I run is a scholarship program. It's kind of hard to, I'm not an educator, I'm not a teacher, but I link people to resources. And if there was a forum where there's people all today who have been sharing ideas, there's great programs that I'm supporting for educational services, but there's no place for somebody like me who would either want to find out about these places, to give these places more money, or just to find out to steer kids in that direction. There's not a forum for that, and there's not also a forum for the nonprofits who are in need of ones to kind of see who's looking to donate money for that. And I think that it's a whole nother conference in itself, starting that sort of platform, but I just feel like there's such a great need, and everybody has their own resources. Everybody's their own little treasure chest, and if there was a way to put it all together, which is unlock a whole different.
I think a step in that direction, I mean, it's been there, and its capacity has gone up and down. It's the Associate Grant Makers, which is the co-sponsor for this conference. I mean, they do connect the different funders in the state by community foundations, private family foundations, so forth and so on. And they do try to do periodic convenings of around interests or around certain segments of the funding world and so forth. So that's a start. Can they do more? I think certainly they can do more, but that really depends on its membership really providing resources and getting more people to join that group. They also do try to provide some clearinghouse information to folks in the community. Again, can they do more? Yeah, but it is what we as a community and a nonprofit community value and want to contribute to that. But that's a starting place. But I agree with you. We can do way more.
Great. Unfortunately, we are 3 minutes over time already. I know that people want to hear the rest, but thank you. Thank you to the panelists,
Thank you.
and thank you for a great conversation.
And I'll collect evaluations from you guys as you do.
Yeah, thank you for being such a great audience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Quote Pepsi, we're the uncola. Just kidding.